Hamilton 91.9.
And online at NHPR.org.
From New Hampshire Public Radio, I'm Laura Knoy, and this is The Exchange. Today, we continue our series of Presidential Primary 2020 candidate forums. This hour, we're talking with Democratic Massachusetts U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren. She's with us before a live audience in NHPR's Studio D. Our questions today will include some of the many we received from listeners, so thank you for your contributions. Also, I'm joined by NHPR reporter Casey McDermott. She and I will both be asking questions. And Senator Warren, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
So you call yourself a capitalist to your bones. Mm-hmm. How do you reconcile that, Senator Warren, with your plans to expand government, raise taxes, increase government regulation? As you know, if you're the nominee, many Republicans will say you're more socialist than capitalist.
Oh, nonsense. You know, capitalism requires rules. Markets require rules. Without rules, capitalism is theft. So for me, it's about making sure we have a set of rules so that you really get competition, so that nobody gets cheated, so that everybody has an opportunity. You know, those are the functions of government, is to help keep the system working in a way that opens up more opportunity for small businesses, opens up opportunity for individuals, opens up opportunity so we can have that competition and create all kinds of new things. That's what I believe in.
Setting aside the regulatory aspects of your proposals, let's talk about the taxes, Senator Warren. I'd love for you to explain it to me. To pay for ideas like free tuition at State College, universal child care, and others, you would create a new wealth tax of 2% on those with wealth of $50 million and up, and 3% on those with wealth of $1 billion and up. How is this different, Senator Warren, from just raising income taxes on wealthy people?
Well, because it's about accumulated wealth. And understand this, we have a few, relatively speaking, great fortunes in this country. About 0.1% of folks in this country have a fortune above $50 million. And you know, something changes when you get a fortune that big. That fortune has its own money managers. That fortune has its own PR. It has its own administrators. It has its own tax advisors. And what's happening is those fortunes are growing and growing and growing. And so what I propose is to say, look, we've been doing a wealth tax forever. Anybody in this room own a home? Yeah. Or grow up in a house, right? That somebody owned the home? Yeah. That you've been paying a wealth tax all those years. They just called it a property tax. What I'm proposing is for the top 0.1%, that is for folks who have more than $50 million in assets, that their property tax include not just the real estate, which is no longer the biggest asset, but that it also includes the stock portfolio, the diamonds, the Rembrandt, and the yacht. You know, that you get all of the property and ask for 2 cents. Your first $50 million is free and clear, but your 50 millionth and first dollar, you got to pitch in 2 cents, and 2 cents for every dollar.
So it's kind of like a property tax on, as you said, the yachts and the Rembrandts, right, and the diamonds.
And understand this about it. There's a reason behind it. You know, look, you built a great fortune in America. Good for you. You had a great idea. You rode it all the way. You worked late at night. You built a great fortune. That's great. But I guarantee if you built that fortune here in America, you built it at least in part using workers all of us help pay to educate. You built it at least in part getting your goods to market on roads and bridges all of us help pay to build. You built it at least in part protected by police and firefighters. All of us help pay the salaries for. And we're glad to do it. We're Americans. We believe in making these investments together. All we're saying is if you make it big, I mean really big, I mean super duper 0.1% big, pitch in 2 cents so everybody else gets a chance to make it in this country.
As you know, Senator Warren, European countries have been getting rid of these wealth taxes 2 decades ago. 12 nations had them. Today, just 3 do. Problems included difficulty assessing the value of assets, people moving assets, an exodus of wealthy individuals and their money from certain countries, and so on and so forth. And in the end, these taxes didn't raise as much revenue as hoped. How confident are you that all the money you anticipate will be available?
Well, I'm really confident in the amount of money that we think this will generate because we can learn from doing it badly. So, for example, the wealth tax in several countries went way too deep into the population. This one is about the top 0.1%. And that has a couple of implications. It means you don't have a lot of middle-class families struggling around with it. It also means you can concentrate your enforcement on just 70,000 fortunes, which is actually not that many. The second part is some countries made the mistake of saying wealth held here in country. Well, guess what really rich people do? They put the yacht somewhere else, right? They move the cash somewhere else. Nope. This one says wherever held. And here's the part that's changed in the world over the last more than a decade. And that is we've been signing more and more treaties with other countries that say, you tell us what assets are held by Americans in your country, and we'll tell you what assets are held by the Swiss or the Spaniards in our country, so that we have a lot better tracking of big assets around the world. Third part of this, Reuven Aviona, who's a terrific tax expert, I think he's at the University of Michigan, did an analysis of this, and he says, look, a big chunk of the wealth held by those at the very top is in the stock market. We already know where it is. With real estate, we've already got the records. With fine paintings, they've been tracked. In other words, we know where a big chunk of this stuff is already. And built right into the plan is super duper enforcement. No more, you assign 2 IRS agents to try to keep up with the whole thing. Nope. We put it right into the cost, is that you've got IRS agents to track this stuff down, to keep track of it over time. And even on top of all of that, we assumed a cheat rate in it. So I know, cynic that we are, right, on doing this. But the whole idea is to have real confidence that the kind of money we're talking about producing really will be there. And I've talked to the tax experts who've been doing this stuff for a long time. I'm confident.
So you think that you could do it better than the failed experience of a lot of these European countries?
Because I think we can learn from it. We can look at it and say, you know what? That was a bad way to do it. We're going to do it a better way than that.
I want to ask you, Senator Warren, about some of the parameters of your spending proposals. And there are a lot, and we could take all day on that. But and Casey McDermott is going to ask you about health care, so we'll set that aside. Student debt cancellation caught my attention. I have one child on the way into college and one in college now. Would there be any limits on how much debt cancellation, Senator Warren, or what type of college or what type of debt? Or is it just everybody gets their debt canceled no matter who or what or where?
So my proposal is that student loan debt would be canceled up to $50,000 per individual. So for a couple, that might be $100,000, obviously, if that's what they had. It's limited on income. So if you've got more than $250,000 in income, you don't get any cancellation. This is for people who have less income than that. It covers all student loans. So the typical federally insured student loans, the Parent Plus loans, if you have a private student loan, you're permitted to convert it to a public student loan and then do the student loan forgiveness so that we get the maximum relief. Now, one of the things I should explain about it, because I think it's important, is in looking through the data on who has student loans and what the impact of this would be, among those it would affect the most are people who did a year of college, who did 2 years of college, and then were just overwhelmed by the costs, who couldn't manage it, who couldn't see a degree program that was working for them. And so they've ended up in the worst of both worlds. That is, they don't have the college diploma to try to put them into the next income category, but they've got all of the student loan debt and student loan debt that is multiplying out for them.
What incentive would colleges have to reduce costs if everybody's debt was paid off?
So this is part of a lot of pieces here. A second part on the same 2 cents, because we're paying for this out of the 2-cent wealth tax, is to provide tuition-free technical school, 2-year college, and 4-year college. But there are some strings on this, and that is about colleges keeping costs under control. So the federal government picks up the tuition part that goes to the students, but in return, the college has both got to do, or the state has to do, maintenance of effort, that is putting that same money into UNH and the other state schools, and the college has to keep those costs under control because they can't just ratchet up tuition around it. So in effect, think of it this way. Let's reverse what you just asked me. Think of it as with the 2 cents. We're going to invest in our babies. We're going to invest in our public schools, and I hope we'll talk about all that. And we're going to invest in post-high school education, but we're also going to deal with the hangover debt from student loans for people who've gone to school in the last 10 years, for some 15, for some 20. 2 other things I should say about the student loan debt, just because you were asking about the numbers. One is the student loan debt number is designed to help reduce the black-white wealth gap. So it turns out that African American students are more likely to have to borrow money to go to school. They borrow more money while they're in school, and they have a harder time paying it off when they get out of school. There's new data out from the Education Department that shows, hang on to your hats on this one, 20 years out, that about 94% of whites have paid off their debts, that about 4% of African Americans have paid off their debts. This is becoming a long hangover tail that once again helps expand the black-white wealth gap where we are now rather than contract it.
And Senator,
we put the numbers where we will actually shrink the black-white wealth gap by about 24 points.
I want to ask you one more question, then turn it over to Casey McDermott. What role would cutting government play in helping to pay for all the proposals that you talk about? Is there any type of spending that you would cut, Senator Warren?
Oh, there are places I would cut spending.
Can you
For
give us a couple
example, over in the
examples?
Department of Defense with OCO. But this is not about cutting. What this is about the 2-cent wealth tax, asking the richest people in this country, the people who have built up fortunes, the people who, quite frankly, may not even be producing a lot of income that they get taxed on as income tax, but who have these great fortunes that are continuing to grow, just asking them to pitch in 2 cents out of those great fortunes to fund an investment in universal child care, universal pre-K, raising the wages of every child care worker and preschool teacher, $800 billion into our public schools, universal college, $50 billion into historically black colleges and universities, and canceling student loan debt for 95% of the folks who've got it.
All right, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Casey McDermott. Go ahead, Casey.
So we're now going to talk about
Hi, Casey.
healthcare.
Okay.
So just a few days ago, I was out talking to voters, and I was talking to a man who lives here in Concord. He said he voted for President Trump in 2016, but he's keeping his options open. He's looking for someone potentially new. And he likes some of what you've said about Medicare for All. He said
That's a good
healthcare is a
start.
big thing for him. But he said, quote, she still hasn't come out and said where this money's going to come from. So where's the money going to come from?
So I'm working on the plan on that, and it's going to be out soon. And it'll talk about 2 things, both how much Medicare for All will cost and how we can pay for it. So it's hard. It's something I've been working on for a long time, but I'll have a plan on it soon.
So we got another question actually from a listener who asked it maybe a little bit more directly. William asked, will my taxes go up under Medicare for All?
Let me put it this way. I have spent a big part of my life studying why families go broke. And one of the principal reasons is the cost of health care. Back when I was studying it, about 2 out of every 3 families that file for bankruptcy did so following a serious medical problem. And here's the thing. About 2 out of 3 of them had health insurance at the onset of the illness or accident. In other words, people who have health insurance are still not covered, but the costs brought them down. So here's how I think of this. We know that Medicare for All is the cheapest way to provide health care coverage for everyone. So we can pay for this. We will see, most likely, rich people's costs go up, corporations' costs go up, but the costs to middle-class families will go down. I will not sign any legislation into law for which costs for middle-class families do not go down. I've spent my life fighting for families who are on the edge of going broke, and we need to change that in this country. And one part of that is we've got to reduce the costs of health care.
Do you have a sense of when we might expect to see?
Soon.
So we'll stay tuned on that.
Okay.
Your colleague, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, told CNBC recently that he does not think that now is the time for him to come out with his own plan on how to cover the costs for Medicare for All. He says that the bigger priority is focusing on making sure that America understands how much they're already paying for health care. I just wonder what you make of that rationale.
Look, Bernie and I have been friends forever. And Bernie's out there talking about how he wants to be president and what his vision is. And I'm here today talking with you about how I'm running for president and what I'm going to put forward. You know, we just each run our own campaigns.
Regardless of what kind of money is involved, Medicare for All would likely result in a pretty significant kind of shift in how our healthcare system is structured. And even supporters of that approach within the health policy world have said that that likely would mean lost jobs in some form. An economist at the University of Massachusetts Amherst told Kaiser Health News earlier this year that that could result in about 2 million jobs lost. He said those would be mostly administrative positions in insurers, doctors' offices. And he said that politicians who want to move toward that system, Medicare for All, have to think about what a, quote, just transition, a fair transition would look like. What would that look like for you?
So I agree. I think this is part of the cost issue and should be part of a cost plan. Although do recognize on this what we're talking about, and that is, in effect, how much of our healthcare dollars have not gone to healthcare? How many of those dollars have been pulled out in other directions? You know, think about the for-profit insurance system that lies right at the middle right now of our healthcare delivery system. That system made $23 billion in profits last year, and that's after all of the executive salaries, all of the administrative people, all the fancy glass office buildings they built. And how did they make those profits? Think about it. It's how much they took in premiums and then turned around and said no. And every time they said no, they made another dollar of profits. That's just not a sustainable healthcare system.
Coming up, more with Democratic presidential candidate and Massachusetts U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren. We'll talk about foreign policy, climate change, education, and much more. You're listening to The Exchange on New Hampshire Public Radio.
Have an old car, motorcycle, or boat that is haunting your driveway? Well, why not donate it to NHPR to support the news you trust and the programs you love? All donations are tax deductible and scheduling a pickup is free. Learn more at nhpr.org/car donation. Support for NHPR comes from you, our listeners, and from Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, providing flexible health plans for any budget to communities across New Hampshire. Get healthy, get happy. Learn more at getharvardpilgrim.com. And from Morno Law, located in Nashua, focusing on family law, estate planning, probate matters, and more, helping good people through tough times. Learn more at mornolaw.com. Mostly cloudy today, chance of some showers in the late afternoon, high temperatures upper 50s to lower 60s. It'll be cloudy tonight with a chance of showers, fog forming after midnight, lows tonight in the low to mid 50s. This is NHPR.
This is The Exchange. I'm Laura Knoy. Today, it's the latest in our primary 2020 candidate forums. We're talking with Democrat and Massachusetts U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren. NHPR's Casey McDermott is also with me. And Casey, I know you had one more healthcare question for Senator Warren.
Yes, we do. And your website, your campaign speeches go into detail on a number of health policy areas, but not as much when it comes to mental health, which is a big issue here locally and across the country. You do say we have to prioritize affordable, high-quality mental health services. You say your Behavioral Health Coverage Transparency Act would hold insurers accountable for providing adequate benefits. But here in New Hampshire and a lot of other parts of the country, the problem isn't just insurance, it's finding someone who can provide that treatment. Just to put it into further perspective, according to our local chapter of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, just yesterday there were 42 adults and 5 kids waiting in ERs across New Hampshire because they didn't have access to the kind of treatment they need. What would you do about that?
So let me make a pitch here for Medicare for All. And that is that it's about universal coverage. And when I talk about universal coverage, it's not simply that every human being gets covered here. It's they also get covered for the full range of healthcare services. And that means both mental and physical health. You know, it's long been the law that there's supposed to be parity in terms of coverage between mental health and physical health. But that simply hasn't happened. The whole idea behind Medicare for All is if providers know that everyone who comes in and everyone who needs it will be fully covered and fully paid for, then more people can move in, more people can open clinics and know that they can make them work economically. I worry a lot about where we are right now with mental health coverage, obviously for adults. I also worry about it for children. And so a part of what I think about is the intersection between making sure we have mental health coverage in our healthcare plans, but also that we're getting the right kind of access in our education plans. The schools are called on to deal with children, to try to help children. Sometimes you have very serious problems, and they need real help to be able to do that. So I think when we're talking about building out, I talk about the wealth tax and the importance of putting more money into our public schools. We didn't get to talk about that as much, but $800 billion into our public schools. Letting more of our schools be community schools, wraparound services with our schools. Think about how transformative it would be if families didn't have to worry about healthcare coverage and those who are providing those services knew they'd be covered. And at the same time, our public schools had more federal dollars put into them as well.
And we're definitely going
to
talk
be able
about
to help take care of our kids.
education,
Good.
because
I'm glad that's
big
the
issue
case.
here in New Hampshire.
Good.
But I want to
Because I
pivot
think these
first,
intersect.
Senator Warren, to foreign policy.
Yes.
After the death of the Islamic State leader in a raid by U.S. forces, I'm sure you were watching that, the Pentagon says there may be more operations targeting other ISIS leaders, and defense leaders tell us there are still many thousands of ISIS forces in the region. What would a Warren administration's broad overall policy be toward ISIS and other potential terrorist groups?
Look, I have confidence in our intelligence community, in our special forces, to locate terrorists and to continue to take them out when necessary. We should be working with our allies to do that. The United States is not the only country interested in beating back the impact of terrorism. What I don't believe is that we should continue to fight endless wars that don't help us here. You know, we're now in our 18th year in Afghanistan. I was on the ground in Afghanistan with Senator McCain in what I think was his last overseas trip a couple of years ago. I talked with Afghan leaders. I talked with our own military leaders. I talked with civilians. And here we were at that point, 16 years in, and what was happening? We weren't winning a war. We had our forces, combined with the Afghan government's forces, controlled less than 60% of the land. The opium trade had expanded.
So not a lot
the
of
border
improvement.
between Pakistan and Afghanistan was a mess. The government was not supported by the people. There was widespread
So
corruption.
you said you'd pull U.S. forces out of Afghanistan?
Combat forces.
Combat
Because
forces.
Here's the thing. Our military is the best on earth. All three of my brothers served in the military. They will do anything we ask them to do, but we should not be asking them to solve problems that can't be solved militarily.
So
For
getting out
that,
of-
we need more diplomatic, more economic, more intelligence, and we need to work with our allies, not turn our backs on them.
So what's the difference between pulling out of Afghanistan but keeping forces in Syria working with the Kurds? Because that was
combat
a big
forces. I want combat
controversy.
forces out of both. Combat forces are not helping. We don't have a mission that we're taking forward. Look, keep in mind that when, for example, we took out Osama bin Laden, it was in Pakistan, a place where we had no forces of any kind. We used intelligence and we used special operations, and we were able to pinpoint where he was and execute on a mission to take him out. We need to use our intelligence. We will need to use our special forces, but that is not the same as waging an endless war.
So more focused, targeted
More
approach,
focused
it sounds like.
on the threats that appear. That's right.
Regarding military involvement and its impact, here's a question from a listener, Wayne,
Sure.
who asks, as a Vietnam veteran, I am wondering how your views on veterans' services have been influenced by knowing the experience of your brothers. And you just referenced your brothers, Senator Warren.
That's right. So as Wayne maybe has heard me say before, my oldest brother, Don Reed, spent about 5.5 years off and on in combat in Vietnam. My second brother, John, was stationed overseas for over a year. My third brother, David, trained as a combat medic. And you better believe, when I talk to my brothers, as I do on a regular basis, I get an earful about the VA and the need to make changes. Part of it is we need to make sure there are adequate resources. You know, I visit VA hospitals that were built more than half a century ago, hallways that are too narrow to get the equipment down, operating rooms that are too small to hold the kind of high-tech equipment that's available today to keep people alive during delicate surgery. We need better facilities. We also need to make sure there are adequate both physical health and mental health resources for our vets. But that takes commitment from the federal government. It takes acknowledging that the costs of war are more than just sending over tanks, that the costs of war are the long-term costs of honoring our promises to our vets. This one for me is personal. I will
Thank
make
you,
sure
Wayne, for
we
the
have the
question.
money in this.
I'm
Yep.
glad he submitted it. And we
Me
have been
too.
folding in questions from our listeners throughout this series of primary 2020 candidate interviews. So thank you again, Wayne, for contributing. One more foreign policy question, Senator Warren, and then I do want to turn it back to Casey. Since President Trump withdrew the U.S. from the Iran nuclear agreement, Iran has taken several major steps away from the original deal, has made some threatening gestures in the region. If you were president, what would your broad approach be toward Iran?
Well, I would go back to negotiating a deal with Iran. I think it was incredibly foolish of the president to withdraw from that deal. I cannot see how it has improved anything. Iran has become more belligerent. Iran has moved closer to the development of a nuclear weapon that has created more instability in the region. I would have stuck with the deal to begin with. Now what we've got to do, we will be where we will be come January of 2021. But I think it is important to work with our allies. That's how we got the Iran deal to begin with. We got our allies to all agree we're going to put economic pressure on Iran. That's how we got them to the negotiating table. We got a good deal negotiated with Iran. And then to not only to pull out of the deal, as President Trump did, but to do it in defiance of all of our allies who had worked with us and who had said the deal is working.
Return to the table, basically.
Yeah,
would
it's
be
get
the
back to the
policy
table
with Iran.
and strengthen the hands of the folks in Iran who want to try to build a more stable country, who want to be a force for stability in the region, instead of strengthening the hand of the extremists in Iran, which is what Donald Trump has done.
Let me turn it back to you, Casey.
Sure. So this is an issue that kind of bridges both foreign and domestic policy,
Okay.
voting and elections. The former special counsel,
There was a time you would have said a question about voting in elections was entirely domestic.
Perhaps, indeed.
Think about what it means that we now think of this as a national security issue and a foreign policy issue.
So on that note, your election reform plan addresses this in some way. You say the federal government will manage the cybersecurity aspects of elections and develop additional security procedures for election administration and end-to-end handling of ballots. But some cybersecurity experts say that the decentralization of U.S. elections, in other words, that they're run at the local and state level, is actually a strength. So how would you balance that?
Look, I believe in getting the best advice you can and the best technical advice. But I have to say, anyone who wants to defend the current system, man, I am just not there. There are current systems that are running on outmoded cyber protection, that are running on outmoded systems. And the fact that there are 50 of them doesn't help us a lot, because what we know is the Russians and others have the patience to go to all 50 of them and try to attack them. And without the kind of expertise and resources for the expertise that we can provide at the federal level, that means the states are individually vulnerable. There'll be some states that'll spend enough money to protect themselves, but what about the ones that don't? And when will we discover it? When it's way too late?
So how do you guard against a situation where perhaps all states are using the same kind of back-end systems for their, voting, elections, other kind of infrastructure, and someone figures out how to get into that, and then it's game over?
Except it's not game over. Let me just do the other part of that, and that is, for me, the importance of truing the vote with paper ballots. I'm all for electronically counting them because it moves faster. I get it. But there has to be a way to be able to go back and say, if there's a problem, how do we know how the people of New Hampshire voted? And that's what a paper ballot does for you. Last I heard, there is no cyber expert on earth who can actually invade a paper ballot. So I think that's what we have to do.
So on a similar note, you've proposed more uniform federal standards around ballot access, perhaps mandating automatic voter registration for one. But, some local election officials, including here in New Hampshire, are wary of a federal official coming in and telling them how to run their elections. How do you deal with that?
Well, you offer best practices and you offer to pay for it. You put money on the table and show them the best way to do it. And then count on the good folks of New Hampshire to elbow their officials until they get it done. I just think that's what's crucial. Look, I don't want a federal government that comes in and says there's only one way to do anything. There are a lot of different ways to do things. Now, I respect that. When we get a chance to talk, for example, about the education plan, it's very much about how it should be done locally. The same is true on health care. I believe in Medicare for All, which is about where you send the bill. But how you actually do the treatment is between the patient and the doctor, or the patient and the nurse, or the patient and the therapist. In the case of voting, let's put the best practices out there. Let's offer to pay for it so it's not going to cost anything. And then if there are variations that are appropriate to New Hampshire for reasons that are specific here, that's what New Hampshire should decide.
So you've also been critical of some recent changes to New Hampshire election laws, including a new residency law that may have some implications for voting. Your top New Hampshire campaign staffer just recently filed an affidavit in a lawsuit that's seeking to overturn that new law. I should say that there's a hearing in federal court today on that same law. Why take that step of getting involved in this kind of case in a state where you're on the ballot?
Well, for two reasons. The first is a point of principle. I believe that every American citizen is entitled to vote and to get that vote counted. And I think that's where we should start. That is the bedrock of democracy. And every effort to try to keep American citizens from voting raises my suspicions. But the second part is that we simply offered evidence of what we're encountering when our folks are out on the ground. And, you put it very diplomatically, might have some effect on it. It's designed to keep college students from voting. Come on, can't we just be blunt about that?
That's actually been something that's been difficult for us to get the state to acknowledge. So that's
whether they acknowledge it or not, we're there to say college students keep coming up to us and saying, I'd like to be engaged in this campaign. I really want to be able to vote in the primary. Can I? I don't know the rules. What are the rules? Am I in? Am I out? Do I have to go register somewhere else? Do I register here? If I register my car, is that what will make the difference? What does it take? So we're here to say two things. Principle, everybody ought to be able to vote. But the second part is to say we have evidence that it's causing great deal of confusion. And when you've got confusion, you suppress voting. And I just don't believe in suppressing voting. Everybody votes. We count it up and count it accurately. That's what democracy's about. That's how it should work.
Senator Warren, I want to ask you about climate change, and Democrats did a very long event on climate change, so I won't get into all the details here because we could spend many hours on it. But I did look at your climate change proposal. There's a long list of ideas. Two that I'd like to specifically ask you about. One is a carbon tax, Senator Warren. Is that part of your climate plan?
Sure, I'm open to this, although I want to be clear. It's just not going to be enough. I don't think that's, if we'd done that 25 years ago, we'd be in a very different position. Today, I think what are going to be the real drivers of attacking climate change are going to be about having regulation in some key industries and about things like a green manufacturing plan, which I'm glad to talk about.
Well, and the other piece that I wanted to ask you about, and again, it's just a quick question, does your decarbonization plan include nuclear power?
So we're going to probably have to rely on existing nuclear power to produce electricity without putting more carbon into the air for some years into the future. But I don't support building new nuclear plants. In all cases, we're going to have to follow the science and where it takes us. I believe in science. That's why one of my principal plans is to double down and double down again and double down again on the investment in research and development in basic science that takes us across the spectrum of not just green energy, but how we clean up the water, how we clean up the earth, desalinization, because there's actually an opportunity here. Think of it this way. We could go to zero carbon emissions as a country by 2030, 2035. That'll be hard work, but we could do it, and I totally support it. But if we do, that's only 20% of the problem. We have to think about the entire world and how we bring down carbon emissions, not just here in America, but all around the globe.
Coming up, more of our conversation with Democratic presidential candidate, Massachusetts U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren. We'll talk about education, campaign finance, and a lot more. Stay with us. You're listening to The Exchange on New Hampshire Public Radio.
The utility PG&E is pulling the plug on millions of customers in California, but its woes highlight a bigger problem. The services we rely on to keep the lights on and our water clean are in desperate need of upgrades. America's struggle to stay home and stay safe. Next time on 1A.
That's this morning at 10 here on NHPR. Support for NHPR comes from you, our listeners, and from Franklin Pierce University, offering bachelor degrees online with flexible schedules in 6 terms per year. Learn more at franklinpierce.edu. And from Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, bringing Dana-Farber expertise closer to you, danafarber.org/locations. Mostly cloudy for today. Chance of some showers by late afternoon. High temperatures today, upper 50s to lower 60s. Cloudy tonight, chance of showers with fog forming after midnight. Lows tonight in the low to mid 50s. This is NHPR.
This is The Exchange. I'm Laura Knoy. Today, our series of primary 2020 candidate forums continues with Democratic presidential candidate and Massachusetts U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren. NHPR's Casey McDermott is also with me asking questions of Senator Warren. And Senator Warren, just before the break, we were talking about climate change. We could talk about this for many hours, but we did receive a question from a listener who really, I thought, asked a great question, and we've been asking all the candidates about this. Her name is Carissa, and she says, what specific steps have you taken in your campaign to ensure that your campaign's environmental impact is as limited as possible? Now, Monday, Tom Steyer told us that he's only flying commercial. And he said that means a lot of time waiting in airports for me and my staff. But there's a huge carbon footprint of a private jet, so that's the sacrifice he said he was willing to make. How about you?
So I've mostly been flying commercial, but we've been trying to look at other ways that we can reduce our carbon footprint. And it's everything from the kind of car we drive and down to do we purchase offsets? Can we make that work as a way to try to reduce the footprint? You know, one of the things that's been so interesting to me in the whole area of climate has been the good ideas that have come from lots of different campaigns. One I just want to get a pitch in here for is when Governor Inslee was running, he talked about the importance of regulating 3 industries, that by 2028, no new buildings, no new houses that have any carbon footprint, 0 carbon footprint on new building. By 2030, all newly built cars and trucks, 0 carbon footprint. And by 2035, all electric production, 0 carbon footprint. We do those 3 things. We cut carbon emissions in our country by 70%. Think about that. 3 things, 70% reduction. Now, we still got to work on the other 30%.
Including
That's not
all the old buildings here in New Hampshire.
We got to work on the 30%. But think about how the willingness to step up and use some regulation in this area could make a huge difference. So I've been working with Governor Inslee on that. That's part of now my plan. But it's part of saying when you can find good ideas, especially on climate change, let's pick them up, because this is not going to be one thing or another thing. It's going to be an all of the above.
Go ahead, Casey.
Sure. So we're going to turn back to education, which I know you alluded to previously, and specifically education funding, which is just a perennial issue in New Hampshire. We've been engaged in court battles, legislative debates over it for decades. According to Vox, you are aiming to turn federal money into a carrot to get states to invest more of their own money. States that adopt progressive funding formulas and keep their promises for allocating that money consistently would get additional Title I money under your plan. But as we mentioned, that's been tough to get New Hampshire officials to buy into. How would you deal with a situation if New Hampshire would not step up the additional funding that would be necessary? What would that mean for New Hampshire students?
So let me describe this slightly differently. No one's going to lose any funding under this plan. But from that 2-cent wealth tax that we talked about back at the top of the hour, we've got about $800 billion that we can put directly into our public schools. What I propose is quadrupling the funding that goes into Title I schools that are teaching low-income children. It's important in designing something like this that you have a strong maintenance of effort and that states are continuing to pay their fair share, because you sure don't want a situation where you put in federal money, the state takes out its money and the kids are no better off. The idea here is to be able to expand. But there's nothing that takes away money from New Hampshire, and there's nothing that requires New Hampshire to do its school funding in any particular way. That's for the folks of New Hampshire to figure out. What I'm doing with this plan is putting money on the table for them. If they do maintenance of effort, if they're trying to put in something to help those kids, then we're going to make sure they get help. There are two other parts on funding that I want to make sure you know about. And the second one is for the first time in history to fully fund IDEA, which means full funding for children with disabilities so that they get the education that they need to reach their full potential. And the third is $100 billion in excellence grants. That works out roughly to about $1 million for each public school system. For each public school, not for systems, each public school. And it's for that school to spend the money the way they want to spend it, the way they think will provide excellence. So up north, it might be that they need a couple of new school buses and some school bus drivers, and that would help them on the transportation end. Somewhere else, it might be that it's time to bring in more counselors, or that they want to be able to expand their music and arts programs.
So as they see fit.
It's as they see fit. It's back to this notion of the federal government shouldn't be telling people how to do it. It's about being a good partner when our local schools are doing their best.
Senator Warren, speaking of money, I wanted to ask you about some of your own fundraising. You say you're 100% grassroots funded in this presidential campaign, most of the money coming from donors giving $200 or less. According to the Washington Post, though, you also tapped millions of dollars for this presidential race with money left over from your U.S. Senate race, which included cash from those high-dollar donors that you sometimes criticize. Why is it okay to use those monies to get this presidential bid off the ground and then swear off that kind of money for the rest of the campaign?
So, look, when I was up for re-election in 2018, I raised $20 million through grassroots donations. And I then gave away or directly raised about $11 million for other Democrats around the country. I gave contributions to every single Democratic Party. I knew that, at least believed, that I could run my campaign without spending a whole lot of money on radio and TV. Instead, going out and doing a lot of town halls was how I ran. And so I had the money left over. And I took
did you
that
have a change of heart about the sources
No, it's
of
not a
those
change of heart.
monies?
It's an understanding. Look, this is a presidential primary. We are Democrats running against Democrats. We have an opportunity to build a grassroots movement, to build a campaign not by sucking up to corporate executives and high-dollar donors, but to build it person by person across this country. We should use this opportunity when it's just Democrats against Democrats to build that grassroots movement. And I'll tell you why. Because come November 2020, when you've built the grassroots movement, that's going to be our comparative advantage.
I want to
If
ask you
running
about
for
that.
president in America is nothing more than going out and sucking up as much money as you can and then running a bunch of TV ads and doing some photo ops, then democracy is going to keep working better and better and better for the richer and richer and richer folks in this country and leaving everyone else behind. I think a primary is our chance to fix that.
About the primary itself. And as you know, Senator Warren, Democrats are desperate to get President Trump out of office. If you're the nominee, what's your message to those Democrats who worry that you're putting yourself at a disadvantage with self-imposed fundraising restrictions? No big money, no corporate money, no PACs. They're worried that you won't be able to compete.
I don't think this is a disadvantage. People have contributed $5 and $10 to my campaign, and Bernie Sanders and I were the two top fundraisers by a huge amount in the latest quarter. And that's the way we funded this campaign. I think people are sick of an America and sick of campaigns that are bought and paid for by billionaires and by corporate executives and by lobbyists who are just in a transactional business trying to make sure that they're going to get what they want on the other side of the election. People invest in my campaign, whether it's $5 or $25, and I should add, whether they volunteer an hour or volunteer every Tuesday morning. It's volunteers that are the heart and soul of this campaign. Look, democracy is broken in America. Democracy is broken. People understand this democracy is working for the rich and not working for much of anyone else. If we can't run a Democratic primary without the high dollar fundraisers
I'm talking
every
about the
single
general
day.
election.
I
The
get
concern
it, but the
is
point
that you'd
is
be at a
if you
financial
don't
disadvantage
build
there.
it now, you won't be there. Now look, I'm not asking Democrats across this country to unilaterally disarm. I'm not asking state parties to disarm. I'll help them raise money. I think that's great. But the way we ought to run our presidential primary and then create the strength that the way we ought to run for president is we ought to do it as a truly democratic movement. Enough people pitching in their $5 and volunteering an hour that we not only win in the process, we actually repair our democracy.
Go ahead, Casey.
Sure. So we asked listeners what they wanted us to ask presidential candidates, and one of the most common themes was how you're going to find common ground when things seem to be so divisive, both in and outside of government. So a listener, Megan from Charlestown, asked, how do you plan to work with the other party when both parties seem unwilling to listen to or work with each other to be effective?
So I do work with the other side. I've gotten more than a dozen bills passed into law, and they've been bipartisan. And that's just been since Donald Trump has been elected president. I got a huge one that I'm really excited about. It's going to reduce the cost of hearing aids by permitting over-the-counter sales, and did it entirely in a bipartisan manner and signed into law by President Trump. I know how to work with the other side, but I think of this as a much deeper question. You know, I mentioned my three brothers back in Oklahoma. One is a Democrat. Yeah, do the math, right? But the thing is, there are things we disagree on, and I get that. And we try to disagree respectfully, and sometimes we even raise our voices. But at the end of the day, our values are very much the same. You know, none of my brothers or I want to see anybody go broke because somebody in the family got sick. None of my brothers or I want to see a child not get the best possible education because that kid lives in the wrong zip code. None of us want to see an America where we can't hold our heads up overseas, where we're seen as the country that turns our backs on our allies and cuts and runs instead of supporting the people who fought alongside us. When we talk about those core principles about who we want to be as a country and the kind of investment we want to make in the future, a future that doesn't just work for the rich, but a future that works for everyone, I think there is a lot of common ground. You know, I'm somebody who has a basic moral guiding principle. There's value in each and every human being. We find that value, we work together, we build a future.
So following up on that same theme, you know, both here in New Hampshire and also nationally, if you're following the coverage of Conversation with Voters, a lot of the things that come up when people talk about your campaign is people like you. Some Democrats might like you, but they worry about whether you could be, at a disadvantage during a general election campaign because of the attack ads that Republicans might run, because of the perception that you're too left-wing, you're a coastal elite, the list goes on. How do you respond to those concerns from people within your own party that you may not be able to survive a general election?
You know, I think of it this way. I think of it as two parts. First, the question is about Donald Trump. He'll be out there every day saying ugly things. Can we just be clear? That won't just be about me. It'll be about whoever our nominee is, whoever threatens this man. Did we just see yesterday where he attacked someone who had served our country honorably? And why does Donald Trump attack him and question his loyalty? Because he threatened Donald Trump. He threatens Donald Trump's security. He threatens Donald Trump's personal interest. So he's going to do this no matter what. But here's what I also believe. The Trump show is growing old. People are just getting tired of this. They're just worn out. And I think folks are ready to change the channel. And so when we change the channel, it can't just be more about Donald Trump. He doesn't get to control every story, every narrative. We got to be there with our ideas about what we can do, about the kind of America that we can build. Our ideas for what's broken and what we're going to do to fix it and how we're going to build a grassroots movement to get it done.
I think, Senator Warren, what we're trying to get at is many Democrats here in New Hampshire, I'm not talking about Donald Trump right now, but many Democrats that we talk to, again, as Casey said, they like the way you campaign, they like your energy, they like some of your ideas, but they do worry that your tax and spending policies will be unpalatable for the general election. They talk to us all the time. They say, we like Elizabeth Warren. We wish she would moderate it a little bit to make herself more palatable in the general. That's what I hear from people.
Well, all I can say is the
so what do you say to those
the 2 cent wealth tax is not only supported by a majority of Democrats and a majority of independents, a majority of Republicans support the 2 cent wealth tax. Look, the idea that this country is working great for the rich and the powerful and not for anybody else, working great for giant drug companies, but not for people who are trying to get a prescription filled, working great for oil companies that want to drill everywhere, but not for the rest of us who see climate change bearing down upon us. It's not just Democrats who see that. It's Democrats and Republicans who see it. I think trying to define things in terms of the old left, right, sure, that's what some of the Republicans want to do. That's what Donald Trump will do if he thinks it'll work, if he thinks anybody's still listening. But the key is to think of the world in terms of how people are living it. People who are trying to get a prescription filled, people who see the high cost of housing, people who are getting crushed by medical bills and student loans. And 2020, we got a chance to change that.
Senator Warren, there's a lot more we could have talked about. Here's a last easy question for you. How many hours of sleep do you get a night?
Oh, I get a good 7 to 8, sometimes 8.5.
Okay.
I sleep. Yep. I do my exercise and I sleep. I'm taking care of myself because I'm going to be in this fight all the way.
Well, thank you, Senator Warren, for being here. Thanks also to my colleague, Casey McDermott. And also thanks to our audience for joining us. Thank you for coming out this morning. This is The Exchange on New Hampshire Public Radio.
The views